Don't take another step toward that door, Dani. Fabrizio Rullo said it quietly. That was the worst part. Not the words, but the quiet. The kind of quiet that filled the corners of a room and pressed the air out of it slowly, the way cold presses through glass in February. Dani Holbrook stopped. Her hand was 6 inches from the elevator button, close enough that she could see the brushed gold of it catching the low amber light of the penthouse foyer. She didn't turn around. For one long, suspended second, she stood there in her grey uniform, her housekeeping cart humming with the faint vibration of the hallway behind her. The hallway she was no longer going to reach. The elevator doors slid shut without her. She turned slowly. Fabrizio Rullo stood at the far end of the entrance hall, jacket off, shirt sleeves rolled to the elbows, a phone in one hand, and his eyes fixed on her with the kind of absolute, unwavering attention that most people never received from anyone in their lives. He was not a physically dramatic man in the way that movies had trained Dani to expect from men like him. No scar running down his jaw, no permanent scowl. He was 51 years old and looked it, in the way that architects of very large, very dangerous things looked their age. Measured, contained, expensive. Silver threaded through his dark hair at the temples. The lines at the corners of his eyes were deep and permanent, carved there by decades of watching rooms for the one thing everyone else had missed. He was, by every metric Dani understood, the most dangerous man she had ever been in a room with. And she had just been caught leaving his private suite with a USB drive tucked inside the chest pocket of her uniform. The drive, Fabrizio said. He didn't cross the room, didn't move toward her at all. He simply extended one hand, palm up, the way a man extends a hand to a dog he isn't sure about yet. Whatever is in that pocket that you're pressing your arm against, put it on the console table. Dani didn't move. Her name was Danielle Holbrook, though no one had called her Danielle since her grade school teachers in Scarborough. She was 26 years old, 5'4", 268 pounds on the last morning she'd stood on the scale in her mother's bathroom off Kingston Road. She had worked the housekeeping floor at the Aldermere Grand Hotel for 3 years. Doubles on weekends, split shifts through the week, $12 in tips on a good day, 17 if she caught the right floor. She had a system for everything. The order in which she restocked the carts, the specific angle of the window squeegee that left no streaks at 54 stories, the way she timed the service elevator to avoid the morning rush from the executive floors. She had never stolen anything from a guest room in her life. Not a bottle of water, not a chocolate from the pillow turned down. She had absolutely not meant to take the USB drive. "It's not what you think," she said. Fabrizio lowered his hand. He tilted his head, not in mockery, but in the way a man tilts his head when something unexpectedly interesting has happened in a room full of expected things. He studied her with an expression she couldn't read, and the quality of his attention felt like pressure, like standing in a room where the barometric pressure had shifted and you couldn't point to why. "Room 4701 is cleaned on Mondays," he said. "This is Thursday, Dani. You're 6 floors below your assigned rotation." He paused. "Which means you didn't find that drive doing your job. You went looking." "I didn't go looking for anything." Her voice was steadier than she'd expected it to be. Maybe because steady was the only option she had left. "I went up to 4701 because I found a keycard on the service elevator floor. A keycard that opens that suite. I thought someone dropped it. I was going to turn it in at the front desk." Fabrizio watched her, said nothing. "When I got to the suite, the door was already open." Dani pulled the USB from her chest pocket and held it up between 2 fingers, not hiding it, not reaching for the elevator, just showing him. Not unlocked. Open. Like someone had left in a hurry. "I went in to check that the room was secured. That's protocol. And I found this on the floor. Half under the credenza by the window. It must have fallen when someone was leaving fast." and instead of leaving it where it was, Fabrizio said slowly, "You picked it up. I was going to bring it to the front desk. But you didn't." "No," the word landed between them. Dani held his gaze. "Because I plugged it into my phone first. I know I shouldn't have. I know that. But it wasn't labeled, there was nothing to identify it, and I thought maybe it was a guest's vacation photos, and I could figure out whose it was and return it properly. And it wasn't vacation photos. No, it wasn't." The silence in the penthouse was extraordinary. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind Fabrizio, the lights of Toronto spread out to the south in a wide, cold sprawl. The CN Tower lit in red and white against the dark sky, Lake Ontario beyond it, a flat black expanse with February ice creeping in from the eastern shoreline. The city below was doing what cities did at 11:30 on a Thursday, moving and breathing and indifferent to the two people 54 floors above it who were deciding something that couldn't be undecided. "What's on it?" Fabrizio asked. "Photographs," Dani said, "of documents taken in this suite." He was still so completely, deliberately still. Transaction records, guest manifests, routing information for shipments through the port of Toronto. She watched his face carefully. She had spent 3 years learning to read rooms, the particular language of spaces and the people who moved through them, and what she was reading in Fabrizio Rullo's face right now was not surprise. It was confirmation. He had already known something was wrong. He just hadn't known where to look. Whoever photographed those documents had been in this suite multiple times. There are timestamps embedded in the image metadata. The earliest one is from 7 weeks ago. Fabrizio crossed the room then. Not fast. He moved the way he always moved, with a kind of absolute economy of motion, as though every step was chosen and the ones he didn't take were equally chosen. He stopped 3 feet away from Dani and held out his hand, palm up again. She placed the drive in it. He turned it over between his fingers. His expression didn't change, but she could see something working behind his eyes, the way you could see weather moving across the lake from a high window before it arrived. "You said photographs of documents. Were the records encrypted or readable?" Dani kept her eyes on his face. "I read them." Something moved in Fabrizio Rullo's dark eyes. It wasn't anger, or not only anger. It was the particular, controlled attention of a man recalculating something at very high speed. And? She had gone over this moment 100 times in the past 4 hours. She had moved through her remaining rooms on autopilot, stripping beds on the 32nd floor, with her heart hammering so hard, she was surprised the guests in the next room hadn't knocked to complain. She had thought about going to the police. She had thought about walking out of the building and not coming back. She had thought about sliding the drive back under the credenza in 4701 and pretending she'd never found it. Pretending she was as invisible as she'd always been, as anonymous as the grey uniform and the quiet cart. But she had thought about Fabrizio reading those records alone, with no warning, with no one standing between him and what was in them. And she hadn't been able to make herself walk away. The photographs were being transmitted, Dani said. Each image file had metadata, GPS coordinates, timestamps, and a destination email address, masked but not well masked. Whoever set up the system knew enough to try to hide it, but not enough to do it properly. The masking protocol was 3 layers, which sounds like a lot until you realize the base routing is just a forwarded alias. She watched his face. The email address routes through a private server registered to a property management company called Faro Holdings. The air in the room changed. Fabrizio did not move, did not blink. The hand holding the USB drive tightened very slowly, the knuckles pressing from brown to white. Sergio Faro, Dani said, because there was no point circling it. She had crossed every line she was going to cross in the past 4 hours, and there was nowhere left to go but straight forward. Your operations manager. He's been photographing your private records and forwarding them to an external contact for 7 weeks. The shipping routes, the guest manifests, the port schedules, everything. She pulled her phone from her apron pocket and turned the screen toward him. But there's more than the RCMP connection. I cross-referenced the routing information. 2 of the port schedules were modified before they were photographed. Changed, then photographed. The cargo rerouted through Montreal. Someone in Montreal is receiving operational intelligence on your shipments in real time. Sergio isn't feeding information to law enforcement to protect himself. He's selling your routes to a competitor. Fabrizio looked at her phone screen. He looked at it for a long time. The city hummed and glittered below them, entirely uninterested. Sergio Faro, he said, has worked with me for 11 years. I know, Dani lowered her phone. I know who he is to this organization. I know who he is to you. She held his gaze even though everything in her wanted to look at the floor, at the window, at anything but those dark, measuring eyes. I've been cleaning these floors for 3 years, Mr. Rouleau. Housekeeping is invisible. People say things in front of housekeepers they'd never say in front of anyone they actually see. I have heard Sergio on the phone twice on this floor in the past month. Once outside 4701, once at the service elevator. Different language both times. Not Italian. What language? Quebecois French. I grew up in Scarborough. We had a lot of kids from Montreal come through my school. I know that accent. The silence lasted a long time. A plane crossed the sky over the lake, blinking slow and methodical through the dark. Why didn't you leave that drive where you found it? Fabrizio asked at last. It was a genuine question. She could hear that. Not a test, not a trap, a man actually asking. Dani thought about her mother's apartment off Kingston Road. The oxygen concentrator running in the bedroom, its rhythm as familiar to her now as her own heartbeat. The medical supply invoices in the kitchen drawer that she'd stopped looking at directly, because looking at them felt like looking at something very bright that caused real pain. She thought about 3 years on these floors, learning the shape of the Aldermere Grand, the way you learn the shape of your own body, not by studying it, but by living inside it, by moving through it every day until its dimensions became instinct. Because someone was going to get hurt, she said, and I found out before it happened, and I couldn't unfind it. She paused. The truth was simpler than any of the explanations she'd rehearsed in the past 4 hours, and she gave it to him plainly. Because I didn't want to. Something in Fabrizio's face shifted, very slightly, the way a room shifts when a lamp is switched on in a far corner. You feel the change before you fully see it. He opened his mouth. The suite's secondary entrance clicked open. Both of them turned. Sergio Faro stepped through the service door that connected the penthouse foyer to the hotel's private management corridor. He was a trim man, 55, grey suit, perfectly pressed. Reading glasses pushed up onto his forehead in the absent-minded way of someone who spent long hours at a screen. He looked, in this moment, precisely like what he had always appeared to be, a calm and reliable operations manager who had been with the organization longer than most of the furniture, longer than most of the staff, longer than almost anyone else in the building. But he was holding a matte black pistol at his side, loosely, the way a person holds something they haven't entirely decided how to use yet. I pulled the security footage, Sergio said. His voice was conversational, almost pleasant. The way voices were pleasant when they'd decided the hard part was already over. He was looking at Dani. Took me a while to find which camera angle caught you picking it up. You were fast, I'll give you that. His eyes moved to Fabrizio. I would have handled this before it became a problem. I had a clean window tonight. I was going to retrieve the drive. The girl would have had an accident, and the whole thing would have been tidied by morning. He shrugged. But you were here. Sergio, Fabrizio's voice had dropped to something very flat, very quiet, Put the gun on the table." "I don't think so." Sergio moved fully into the foyer, letting the service door fall shut behind him. The latch clicked. "This is actually a cleaner outcome than I'd planned. A housekeeper who had no business being on this floor. An evening conversation that went wrong. The coroner won't be surprised." He looked at Dani again. The pleasantness was gone, replaced by something tired and businesslike. "You should have left it under the credenza, sweetheart. Someone would have found it Monday morning, and it would have been back in my hands before Fabrizio ever saw it." Dani looked at the gun. Then she looked at Sergio's right shoulder. The one that sat slightly lower than the left, the one he'd been favoring since December. She'd noticed it, the way she noticed everything on this floor, the way you noticed things when you were invisible. The physiotherapy appointment he'd rescheduled twice. The way he reached across his body to lift things from his left side. The particular, careful way he pulled on his coat each morning. She looked at the whiskey decanter on the console table to her right. Solid crystal, wide-bellied, nearly full. Sergio raised the gun toward Fabrizio's chest. Dani grabbed the decanter and threw it. She had bowled in a league in Scarborough until she was 19, and she threw with her whole body. The weight shifting from her back foot through her hips and her shoulders in one practiced, unthinking motion. 268 pounds of momentum released in one clean arc across 12 feet of travertine foyer. The crystal connected with Sergio's right shoulder, the bad one, and the sound it made on impact was something Dani felt in the back of her teeth. The decanter was too solid to shatter. It hit him and bounced to the floor and cracked in two, scotch spreading in a dark, spreading stain across the pale stone. Sergio staggered hard, his arm dropping, a hoarse shout tearing out of him. The gun skidded sideways across the floor. Dani was already moving. She crossed the foyer in 3 heavy fast steps and put her shoulder into Sergio the way she had put her shoulder into 100 overloaded linen carts over 3 years of double shifts, using her weight rather than fighting it, letting the mass of herself do the work that smaller people had to manufacture through leverage and effort. She hit him full in the chest and drove him backward into the wall. His head struck the plaster. She grabbed his wrist with both hands and pressed it hard against the surface, and she held on. Her weight against his frame, her hips braced forward, her feet planted wide on the scotch-slicked floor. He was 55 and wiry, and she was 26 and solid, and for the 3 seconds it mattered, she was completely immovable. Sergio snarled, thrashing. He drove his knee upward and caught her in the stomach, and the pain was bright and total, and she gasped, but she did not let go. She twisted his wrist instead, her nails digging into the skin of his forearm, and he roared. "Fabrizio!" she shouted, because her arms were shaking, and she could feel her grip starting to slide. Fabrizio was already there. He took Sergio off the wall with one hand on his collar and hit him once, exactly once, with a force that snapped Sergio's head hard to the side. Sergio crumpled. Fabrizio lowered him to the floor without ceremony, stepped back, and looked at him the way a man looks at a problem he has resolved and does not intend to revisit. The foyer went entirely quiet. Dani stood with her hands braced on her knees, breathing in long, ragged pulls. The broken decanter lay in 2 pieces on the travertine. Scotch had settled into the grout lines, and the whole penthouse smelled like the inside of a very expensive bar. Her stomach was aching where Sergio's knee had connected. Her hands were not completely steady. Fabrizio pulled out his phone. He dialed, spoke briefly and quietly, names and a room number and a phrase Dani understood without wanting to fully understand it. He hung up and turned around. He looked at her without speaking for a long moment. His shirt cuff had a thin line of blood on it. Sergio's ring had caught him somewhere, and he glanced at it with the mild, faintly inconvenienced expression of a man noting a dry cleaning problem. Then his gaze came back to her. Dani straightened up. She pressed her hands flat against her thighs and stood as straight as she could, which was not particularly graceful, given that she was still catching her breath, and her hair had come half out of its clip, and she was standing in a spreading pool of single malt scotch. She had never once in 3 years been looked at by this man in a way she could not account for with professional logic. Until now. "I'm sorry about the decanter," she said, because she had nothing else. Fabrizio looked at the 2 pieces of baccarat crystal on the floor. Back at her, a sound came from him, not a laugh but close enough. The first unguarded sound she had ever heard him make in 3 years of invisible proximity. "That was a $1,200 decanter," he said. "I know, I've cleaned it twice." He crossed the foyer. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she had to tilt her chin up slightly to hold his gaze. Up close, she could see the exhaustion in his face. Not from this evening, but from something that had been accumulating for a long time. 11 years of trusting a man he had built something with. The weight of that kind of betrayal did not arrive all at once. It settled in slowly, like cold through old windows. "You plugged an unidentified drive into your personal phone," he said. "In a suite you had no clearance to enter." "Yes." "You read confidential operational records." "Yes." "And then you brought those records to me, personally, instead of going to your supervisor. Instead of going to the police. Instead of walking out of this building and spending the rest of the night pretending you found nothing." "Yes." "Why?" Dani had thought about what she would say if he asked her that directly. She had rehearsed careful, professional answers during 4 hours of stripping beds and polishing mirrors on autopilot. Explanations that made sense in a transactional way, that placed a reasonable distance between what she'd done and what it actually meant. She gave up on all of them. "Because I have been on this floor for 3 years, she said, and in 3 years I have learned what this building is, and I chose to stay. Which means I am not neutral about it." She held his gaze. "I made a judgment call tonight. I decided you needed to know before anyone else did, and I don't think I was wrong." Fabrizio looked at her, really looked. The kind of looking she was not accustomed to from anyone, that took in all of her without sliding past or settling anywhere it wasn't supposed to. Her round face and the breadth of her shoulders and the grey uniform that had never in 3 years looked like anything other than exactly what it was. He looked at her the way she had occasionally caught him, looking at structural blueprints, with absolute attention, trying to understand not just what a thing was, but what it could bear. "You could have been killed tonight," he said. "I was aware of that." "Then why?" "Because," Dani said, and her voice caught on the word, and she stopped and started again. "Because I found something that was going to hurt you. And I am not the kind of person who can find that and walk away from it." The words sat in the air between them, unretractable, entirely honest. "I've never been that kind of person. It's inconvenient, mostly." Fabrizio was very still for a long moment. Then he reached out and, slowly, with the careful deliberateness of a man who understood that some gestures could not be taken back, placed one hand against the side of her face. His palm was warm. His thumb rested at the curve of her cheekbone with a gentleness that was completely at odds with everything else she knew about him and everything she had just watched him do. He didn't pull her toward him. He simply held her there, like something he was making sure was real. "Sergio will be handled," he said quietly. "The Monreal connection will be severed. I have people for this, and it will be resolved by morning." He paused. "But you..." Dani waited. "You are not going back to the 32nd floor. You are not going home tonight. And you are not going to hand in a notice and disappear, because I have already calculated exactly how long it would take me to find you in that building off Kingston Road, and I would rather not spend my time that way." "You know where I live," Dani said. It was not a question. I know every person on these floors. His thumb moved the smallest possible motion against her cheekbone. I have always known you were here, Dani. I have simply been patient. She had spent 3 years making herself invisibles in this building. She had mastered the timing and the roots and the particular art of moving through a space without leaving any trace of herself in anyone's attention. She had been very good at it. She had thought she was invisible. You threw yourself between a loaded gun and a man you work for, Fabrizio said, not because you were paid to, not because you had no way out, because you decided to. He held her gaze, and there was something in his eyes now that had the quality of something on long contained, something that had been kept under pressure for longer than tonight. That kind of decision tells me something. What does it tell you? That you are not, and have never been, just a housekeeper. Outside the windows, Toronto went on doing what it did at midnight on a Thursday in February, the gardener carrying its thin line of late-night headlights, the CN Tower blinking red and steady over the dark water, the cold pressing against the glass and finding no way through. The Aldermere Grand was 54 floors above all of it, and Dani Holbrook stood in the wreckage of an 11-year betrayal. Scotch in the grout lines, broken crystal on the travertine, a man unconscious on the floor, with the warmth of Fabrizio Rouleau's hand against her face and no clear idea of what came next. She had walked into this building tonight as invisible as she had ever been. She understood with complete clarity that she was not going to walk out the same way. "The decanter," she said at last. "Are you going to take it out of my pay?" Fabrizio looked at the 2 pieces of baccarat crystal on the travertine floor, then back at her. Another sound came from him, warmer this time, fuller, the kind of sound that changed the shape of a face. "Keep the pieces," he said. "They're yours."